This episode of Ben Franklin's World is brought to you by DelanceyPlace.com. DelanceyPlace.com's free daily emails offer thought-provoking excerpts from history books. For example, one of DelanceyPlace.com's emails contained an excerpt from Eric Shellrus' An Age of Infidels. The email highlighted that between the 1770s and 1830s, many Americans proclaimed a belief in deism. Deists believed in two basic points. First, they accepted the existence of God, but rejected Trinitarian theology. Second, they denied that the Christian Bible contained a special divine revelation of God's will. Basically, deists rejected supernatural revelation in favor of reason as the only source of true religious knowledge. Today we view theist theology as keeping with the philosophy of the Enlightenment, but at the time, many Christian ministers excoriated deists as heretics and infidels. Sign up for DelanceyPlace.com's free daily emails to receive more thought-provoking quotes and ideas from history books right in your inbox. Text nonfiction to 22828 or visit dp1776.com.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 127 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. In many ways, the Enlightenment gave birth to the United States. Enlightened ideas informed protests over imperial taxation and governance, and over whether there should be an American bishop. The Enlightenment is an important period for us to understand if we're truly to understand early America, and yet, it often seems like trying to grapple with the Enlightenment is easier said than done. It was such a complex event that many of the books written about it offer different definitions of what it even was. So today, we're going to take another go at trying to better understand the Enlightenment. Carolyn Winterer, a professor of history at Stanford University and author of American Enlightenments, Pursuing Happiness in the Age of Reason, is going to take us through her ideas about the Enlightenment and how it influenced early America. During our conversation, Carolyn reveals what the Enlightenment was and when it took place, the Republic of Letters and Americans' participation in that republic, and details about the different enlightened fields of study that Americans helped to develop and participated in. But first, thank you for listening to Ben Franklin's World each week and for considering the ideas of its guest historians. You've really helped the show grow in size, and you've enriched my life in so many ways with all the history and ideas you share with me in your emails, tweets, and Facebook posts. I know you really value this podcast, and I just wanted to take a moment to let you know that I appreciate you too. Okay, let's dig into our historical adventure. Are you ready to explore the ideas and events of the American Enlightenment? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a professor of American history and the Anthony P. Meyer Family Professor in the Humanities at Stanford University. She's the director of the Stanford Humanities Center and a specialist in American ideas, culture, and political theory prior to 1900. She's the author of 3 books, including The Mirror of Antiquity, American Women in the Classical Tradition, 1750 to 1900, and, most recently, American Enlightenments, Pursuing Happiness in the Age of Reason. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Carolyn Winterer.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
And we're delighted to have you back, Carolyn. And I guess that really means I should have said, welcome back to Ben Franklin's World, because you've been a guest on this podcast before when you were one of our guest historians in that very first episode of the Doing History, How Historians Work series.
Yeah, and that was very interesting to talk about how we do history. So I'm really excited to be back on the show.
Now, the last time you were here, we discussed why historians study history, and today we're going to talk about your study of history, specifically the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment is a big topic, and we've discussed it on the show before with many other scholars, and every time we've asked one of those scholars what the Enlightenment was, they give us a different answer on all the movements and ideas that comprise the event. So, in keeping with that tradition, would you tell us what you think the Enlightenment was and when it took place?
I will. But first I want to start by saying that I began with the same sense of multiplicity of opinions that you just articulated, that when I would teach my students at Stanford about the Enlightenment, I ran across a historiography that had a bunch of scholars all telling me different things about what the Enlightenment was and who was in it and who was not in it and what exactly the ideas were that the Enlightenment consisted of. And it was, in fact, exactly for that reason that I wrote this book, because I became frustrated that no one could pinpoint with any degree of consistency or any sense that they could point to a particular source about what the Enlightenment was. And so I vowed to go behind all of the historiography of the 20th century to look into the 18th century about what people then thought the Enlightenment was. So my definition of Enlightenment in this book is what 18th century people, especially in the Americas, said when they use the word enlightened or the word enlightenment, always with a small e in the 18th century. They always meant two things. They could add to those two things, but they always meant two things at least. One was using human reason to make the world a better place. So human reason as opposed to tradition handed down from popes or kings or any kind of authority from the past. And human reason as opposed to myth or superstition. The second thing that they thought was that they could make the world a better place, that progress was in fact possible. And this was in contrast to prevailing ideas of how history worked. People thought either that the best thing that ever happened was the Garden of Eden, and that having been kicked out of the Garden of Eden for sinning, human beings were destined to decline into a state of sinfulness ever after. Or they thought that, as Republican history told them from ancient Rome onward, history moved in cycles, up and down, up and down, up and down. So what the 18th century saw was an emancipation from those two ideas of what was possible for human beings to do during their time on Earth. And they were the first people who in large numbers began to say, we don't just have to get worse. We don't just have to go up and down in cycles. We can keep getting better all the time. And the way we do that is by applying human reason, our own God-given human reason, for the improvement of society. So in some senses, my definition of enlightenment is one, very simple, and two, it's also coming from the mouths of 18th century people themselves. I'm not adding anything to it. It's just very much from the mouths of my historical actors.
Yeah, you noted in your book, American Enlightenments, that you specifically tried to uncover what 18th century Americans thought the Enlightenment, with a small e that is, what it was, and to try and restore their understanding of it to them. So I wonder if you would tell us, how we got so far away from that simple contemporary 18th century definition of the Enlightenment, and how the Enlightenment came to be this complex series of ideas and events that we know it as today.
We have a lot at stake in identifying what's going on in the 18th century, especially in the United States, because the founding of our nation occurred at that time. So what happened over the course of the 20th century is that people began to invest this 18th century moment with all kinds of meanings and possibilities and kind of freighted it with significance that it didn't really have. The biggest moment came in the post-World War II era, a kind of a 20 or 30-year period that we can think of as the larger Cold War era, when the totalitarian threat that was being manifested in Europe truly terrified Americans. And this is the first time where we see the term the American Enlightenment, capital E for Enlightenment, being invented. The first book to use it in the title came out in the 1960s. So this was a moment that was invented as a bomb shelter of ideas that would protect Americans from the ideological menace that was being manifested in the aftermath of Nazi Europe, fascist Italy, and of course the ongoing threat of totalitarian Russia. And what American scholars and opinion makers, even artists at that time were saying was that from the very founding moment of the United States, there was a heritage of freedom and democracy that would essentially vaccinate Americans from the kind of dark thought control going on in mid-20th century Europe. Now, your listeners who know the 18th century will know that the words freedom and democracy are not really the words that 18th century people thought in. They thought about liberty and they thought about republics, but they didn't really think about freedom and democracy. Those are the words and ideas of a later era. So the concept of the American Enlightenment, capital T, capital A, capital E, was invented in the middle of the 20th century in order to soothe American fears about dark ideologies abroad. When I realized that, which I kind of hesitate to admit was pretty far into the research process, when I realized that this was a modern construction rather than the actuality of the 18th century, that was so liberating because I realized I didn't have to go find some American Enlightenment in the past that didn't exist. And it also explained to me why I would hear such a variety of opinions from my wonderful contemporary colleagues about what the American Enlightenment was. They could just say whatever they wanted that it was. So what I wanted to do was to scrape away those barnacles and just go back with a microphone into the 18th century and ask the people there, hey, when you want to become enlightened, what is it that you're trying to do? So I listened to them, and the chapters in the book actually emerged from the topics of conversation that 18th century people themselves talked about when they talked about becoming enlightened.
Wow. Talk about an example of how each generation rewrites history to suit its own needs and interests. I mean, the story of the Enlightenment and how we've come to understand it as a complex event is a really interesting story and one that really illustrates that point.
Yeah, exactly. And, this is actually a larger challenge for historians today. We are now 50 years out of the Cold War era. And I submit to your listeners that this is a wonderful moment for reevaluating a lot of the scholarship of the mid-20th century and the ways in which the Cold War and its anxieties helped to shape a huge number of historical inquiries. We're now far enough away that we can begin to see the way the Cold War kind of imposed its anxieties onto scholarship. And so this book would form part of that reevaluation.
Now, in your book, American Enlightenments, you talk about something called the Republic of Letters. And you tell us that Americans use the Republic of Letters as an avenue to participate in the Enlightenment. So I wonder if you would tell us about the Republic of Letters and about how Americans participated in it.
The Republic of Letters was an imaginary community of scholars and artists and other intellectuals that thrived from about the Renaissance until the early 19th century, mostly in Europe, but also in the places that were colonized by Europe during that time. And the Republic of Letters thrived at the very moment when literacy rates were beginning to rise and when paper became more common, as well as the implements that you write on paper with. So this was the great age of the letter, in which scholars and opinion makers could form a community of individuals who communicated with one another, often over vast distances, thanks to improvements in shipping, about a variety of matters that didn't always involve matters of state or matters of religion. The two big actors in the early modern world are always monarchies and other state apparatuses and the church. And what we see forming around these big things, like little mammals scurrying at the feet of the dinosaurs, is a community of people who began to make inquiries into the world around them. This is the age of the scientific revolution. It's the age of the expansion of the arts, of symphonies, of all of these things. This is the Republic of Letters. Now, it's based in Europe, but North Americans, during and after the era of English and French and Spanish colonization, begin to participate in that world. So what we find is from the 17th century forward, but especially in the 18th century, people who are colonizing North America are writing to Europe and receiving letters back from Europe about what is happening in the Americas. And the Americas are just so interesting and mysterious to everybody. It's literally a new world for people who arrived there after the native peoples. So this correspondence, most of the Republic of Letters takes place in correspondence, is absolutely brimming with exciting news, observations, all these kinds of things. Some of the people who will come to the mind of your listeners as the great patriots of the American Revolution, Jefferson, Franklin, Madison, they're also mega participants in the Republic of Letters. Franklin, for example, sent and received over 20,000 letters over the course of his life. Any one of these letters is exemplary of the kinds of things people talked about in the Republic of Letters. So since I was trying to talk about the conversations in which people try to improve themselves through human reason over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, I was looking at this wonderful and rich correspondence that often actually included objects as well. People didn't just send letters, they sent stuff with their letters, like caterpillars or pieces of wood or antlers or funny things from the Americas that they thought would be interesting to people in Europe. So one of the great historiographical interventions that this particular book makes is to say that enlightened thinkers were not based in Europe and then diffused outward to bring their wisdom to the Americas. What I saw through these letters was that Enlightenment was a transatlantic process that did not diffuse from any one single area, but that was a constant multi-centered conversation in Europe, in the Americas. People were writing back and forth and exchanging the kind of data and information that was necessary to use human reason to make the world a better place.
Could we look more practically at how the Republic of Letters worked? How did someone like Madison, Jefferson, or Franklin get involved with exchanging ideas with Europeans? Because it seems like Americans may have written more letters to Europeans than they did to each other.
Yeah, well, that's a wonderful observation. So we have to remember that colonial British America, we should say, is the fringe of an enormous empire whose base is London. So before the American Revolution, in fact, if you were a colonist in one of the 13 colonies, you didn't have a ton of communication between the colonies. That came later with U.S. nationalism. You wrote to the center of the empire. You wrote to London. So somebody like Ben Franklin becomes a colonial agent, is naturally a creature of London. And he, in fact, spends nearly 20 years there between 1757 and 1775. So the key to access in the Republic of Letters is to get to one of these great intellectual and political centers in Europe. So that would be, if you're a British American, it's London. It's one of the largest cities in the world. 750,000 people live in London, as opposed to the largest cities. We can't even call them cities. They're towns in British America, which have, about 20,000 people. So someone like Franklin not only himself writes to London and then goes and lives in London, and this is critical for answering your question, he becomes a node for other people to become involved in the Republic of Letters. So when you read the letters that are going to Benjamin Franklin during his time in London, a number of them are saying, hey, Ben, could you please also introduce my nephew so-and-so to this other famous figure, say David Hume, who he gets to know while he's in London. And the same thing happens after Franklin goes to Paris. He makes a couple of visits to Paris. We see the same pattern when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson reside in Paris, is that they become nodes for connecting other Americans to the Republic of Letters. So it's a highly personalized method of engagement with the centers of the Republic. And it's really, really important to have that kind of face-to-face contact with people, just like today, and a lot of the online platforms that we use for social networking, in fact, in some ways were pioneered in the 18th century, the importance of face-to-face contact, and like Facebook is an example of that.
When we've explored other issues of 18th century trade, our guests have told us about the Navigation Acts and how those acts work to keep British Americans trading solely with the British Empire. And, of course, we know that the Navigation Acts weren't 100% effective because there was a lot of smuggling that took place. Speaking now of the 18th century trade in ideas, were any of the Americans' ideas kind of smuggled, for lack of a better term, to Enlightenment thinkers in other European countries? Or did Americans trade their ideas solely with enlightened thinkers in Great Britain?
Yeah, lots of smuggling of ideas. Ideas are easier to smuggle than than other things like munitions. So, right, the thing that happens is that ideas from the Americas get moved into London, and then from London, they are translated into the major European languages. So Latin is still the language of international scholarly communication. So you'll get a figure like James Logan of the Mid-Atlantic region who writes to London about a scientific matter, and his book is translated into Latin for consumption on the continent. So the books get translated into French, into Spanish, into German, and we see that ideas begin to pop up in unlikely places very far from their point of origin, and then, as ideas always do, to move into unexpected directions. So yes, there is idea smuggling, I like your term, during this moment.
Now that we have a good idea of how the Enlightenment worked, at least in terms of how ideas were exchanged, let's explore some of the ideas that Americans and Europeans were talking about. Geology is a science that developed during the Enlightenment. Carolyn, would you tell us about the birth of the field of geology? What about earth science fascinated men and women of the 18th century?
Well, earth science fascinated people because the Bible begins with earth science. Genesis is geology at this time. So God creates the earth, puts people on it, they sin, he sends a huge flood that is described in Genesis to wipe out the sinful people. Now, this is the geology narrative that is 100% accepted in the 18th century. Now, the place of the New World is very, very ambiguous in the flood narrative in Genesis because the Americans are not mentioned in the Bible, nor are the American Indians mentioned in the Bible. And so when British people come to North America, they look around and they say, I wonder what this is. And they imagine that, in fact, the New World was literally new, that it came out of the waters imagined in the Bible, in the biblical flood last. And they had all kinds of ideas that emerged out of that fact. They couldn't figure out what responsibility the Indians had for the flood, since the Bible is silent on that matter. What happens over the course of the 18th century is that they begin to look around themselves at the geological features of the Americas, specifically the Appalachian Mountains, which are the western barrier during the 18th century to British colonization. And they see strange things. They see, for example, seashells high in the peaks of the Appalachians. And they ask themselves, well, how come there are seashells high in the mountains? And at first they think, well, this is because the biblical flood probably carried shells very high. But then they begin to imagine themselves out of the biblical narratives because they increasingly begin to make less and less sense to them. So what we see over the course of the 18th century, and this is why geology became so important for this book, is that information, data from the Americas is transferred back to Europe and begins to corrode European senses of the truthfulness of the biblical story of the Earth's creation. So it's not just information coming out of Europe that affects America, but it is information from the Americas, the weird fact of finding shells high in the Appalachians, that stuns European scientists and helps them on their road to enlightenment as well. So that chapter is really critical for establishing the major thesis of the book, which is that it's always this transatlantic conversation of information gathering and information sharing that helps to move people away from what increasingly began to be called superstition, the stories of the Bible that had explained the world to people for so many hundreds of years.
So it sounds like in many ways, religion was a starting point. Or I guess I should say Christian religion was a starting point for many who wanted to get involved with the Enlightenment and learn more about the world around them.
Yes. We often are asked to teach the Enlightenment as something that is opposed to religion, especially Christianity, but that's not the right way of looking at it. Enlightenment and Christianity, reason and belief are not opposed to one another in the 18th century. It's not possible to imagine your way out of a religious framework in the 18th century. That's the work of the late 19th century. So basically, people are wandering around with various degrees of commitment to the ideas that are expressed in the Bible. What they begin to do, though, is to ask questions about how they know those things in the Bible and how they might use reason and data from the world around them to ask questions about the Bible and about the things that are part of accepted religious dogma. But they're always working within a framework that says, at the very least, that there is a God and that he created the earth probably at some point, and this is a very enlightened way of looking at it, that he created laws about how the physical world works, and that then he kind of stepped back and now is allowing those laws to take place. And someone like Newton finds those laws and says, this is how objects move through space, and it's always going to work like this. But they had no doubt that it was God who had created those laws. So we have to be very, very careful when we're working in the 18th century to remember that they're, for the most part, not anti-religious, but they are trying to expand the grounds of engagement with the body of belief and thought that we call religion.
That makes a lot of sense, because when we look at who participated in the Enlightenment, at least on the American side, there were many clergymen who participated by trying to answer questions about the world they lived in. Like ministers Cotton Mather and John Winthrop.
Yeah, they're on the very, very early end, and they themselves actually didn't really use the terms enlightened or enlightenment because they were so much on the early end of things. But yeah, Cotton Mather is a classic example. He was very, very engaged with what was going on in the Royal Society in London, which is like the National Science Foundation of 17th century and 18th century England. And for him, as for Jonathan Edwards, the great theologian, the natural world was an opportunity not just for scientific inquiry, looking at the ways, as Jonathan Edwards did, that a spider could fly in Newtonian fashion through the air, but that this was an occasion to ponder the wondrousness of the deity. There's a wonderful quotation from Cotton Mather where he's thinking about ants, the little black ants, A-N-T-S, and he says, "Oh, great God, I am astonished. I am astonished." And that's his scientific conclusion after studying the ants, that he is astonished at the wondrousness of the deity in presenting this world to us. So that's really critical as you kind of move into the 18th century, is to remember that there's no opposition between religion and enlightenment. It's just a new way of imagining what religion and a religious outlook might be.
And as participants in the Enlightenment reimagined what a religious outlook might have looked like during this period, they were also trying to figure out what role Native Americans may have played in biblical stories like Noah's flood, just as you mentioned earlier. And one of the questions that many participants in the Enlightenment asked about Native Americans was whether they had ever been enlightened. So, Carolyn, why don't we now address what 18th century Americans and Europeans thought about what made some people enlightened and why they questioned whether Native Americans had ever been enlightened?
Yeah, well, they wondered because it said something about themselves, about British Americans. So the reigning wisdom from Europe about the newness of the Americas, that they had come last out of the flood waters, was that because of this, the climate of all of the Americas was cold and wet. Like one is when one comes out of the bath, right? You're cold and wet because you just came out of the water. And because of that, all life forms, humans, plants, and animals, were stunted in the Americas. Don't ask me the reasoning process here, but this is what they thought. This was what somebody like Montesquieu, a great thinker of the 18th century, thought. And so British Americans, French Americans, Spanish Americans approached the Americas with this idea that there were these mysterious peoples already there who were lower life forms because they grew up in this cold and wet climate. And therefore, Europeans who spent time in the Americas would probably degenerate as well. This was a huge fear among British American colonists in the 18th century. It was a fear that dogged the American revolutionaries. How could they ever found a new republic, given that the climate of the Americas was going to condemn all of their efforts to be stunted little plants? So what they needed to do was to find an example of American Indians who had not withered in the American climate. Now, they had enormous contempt for what they thought of as the wandering tribes of the North American Indians. What they needed were Indians who they thought of, and I'm using their terminology here, they thought of as closely replicating civilized European society. And they found those Indians among the Aztecs. So British Americans in the late 18th century became fascinated by Aztec civilization. They were the ones who coined the term Aztec. Before that time, they called them the ancient Mexicans. So Aztec is an Enlightenment term to dignify the urban societies of Mesoamerica with the appellation of civilized, in order, in part, to counter European suspicions that when you came to the Americas, the climate would make you degenerate. So Aztec civilization became an object of interest and wonder and excitement, and it's a kind of interest that has stayed with us to this day. And what the book does is to resurrect some of the many reasons why the Aztecs and the various societies around the Aztecs became so exciting to British American revolutionaries.
How did Americans and Europeans go about researching their questions about the Nahuatl or Aztec peoples of Mexico? Were there archives that they could go and visit and look at documentation or objects left behind by the Nahuatl? I mean, how did they conduct historical research in the 18th century?
Yeah, so there were archives. The Nahuatl peoples left behind many, many, many manuscripts. The most colorful ones that, in the opinion of Europeans, were the most beautiful, were packed up and shipped to Europe. So even today, we have the aftermath of the Enlightenment playing out, which is that some of the most famous Aztec codexes or codices are not in the Americas, they are in European archives. So, for example, the Codex Mendoza of the 16th century is in the Bodleian Library in Oxford rather than in Mexico City. So there is an enormous written corpus that emerges out of Mesoamerica as compared to the relatively sparse written corpus that comes out of North American Indian remains. So what happens in the 17th and 18th century is that those Mexican manuscripts and artworks are shipped to Europe. They are published and translated and put into broad circulation in the Republic of Letters. So John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and others have examples of some of these Mesoamerican manuscripts in their own libraries. What happens over the course of the 18th century is that a number of Mexican intellectuals based in Mexico City and elsewhere begin to collect archival material and create some of the first archives of the Aztec past. And they begin to communicate for the first time with North American intellectuals about Aztec civilization. So, one of the strange things about European empire building in the New World is that British American and Spanish American empires are very sealed from one another intellectually for a variety of reasons. This begins to break down in the late 18th century. And in fact, the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia becomes one of the first major repositories for information in North America about what happened and what is happening in Mexico during the 18th century. And, there's manuscripts and all kinds of things. So this is a really key moment in the American Enlightenment, is when some of the intellectual and political barriers between Spanish America and British America begin to break down under the pressure of wanting to know more information about what makes you civilized and what makes you uncivilized.
A complementary question to this question of whether or not Native Americans had ever been enlightened or civilized or uncivilized is the early American desire to figure out where Native Americans fit within colonial British America and the later United States. Carolyn, would you tell us about the early American quest to figure out where Native Americans fit within colonial America and American society?
Yeah, well, the Constitution requires that you count people to represent them. So suddenly the colonial American counting projects, of which there are many, begin to take on a new political meaning. The American Indians are, labeled as Indians not taxed in the Constitution. And so that opens up all kinds of interesting questions and problems. In the late 18th century, they begin to imagine, as part of the Enlightenment quest to improve human societies, that populations can be improved over time. But you can't improve them, you can't improve populations unless you understand them. And so begins this quest to count and to understand what they begin to call the Indian population. And that term, the Indian population, is coined in 1785 by Ezra Stiles, who is, among other things, the president of Yale University, but also a minister and a great fan of counting a whole bunch of things. But it's very much part of the Enlightenment quest, not just to count the Indians, but to move them out of what they call savagery, which they identify as people who wander around and aren't settled in one place, from savagery to civilization. So those of your listeners who know about Jefferson's ideas and projects for the American Indians will see that this fits right in, that this new idea of population has a social control aspect to it that is critical to the Enlightenment program of what they think of as improvement. We would disagree with that today, of course. But what I wanted to do was to pull out a term that we take for granted today, Indian population, that seems very kind of scientific, seems very straightforward, and to show that it emerged at a particular historical moment. It involved a particular number of historical quests, and that it was far from being innocent. It was extremely important for informing how American Indians were understood and treated during the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Let's turn now to slavery, because for those who participated in the Enlightenment, they generally saw answers to the question of how do we improve society and life? So, how did the Enlightenment and the pursuit of enlightened thinking coexist with slavery?
Yeah, that was a difficult question. We imagine today that the only enlightened response to slavery is emancipation. And that, of course, came about in 1865. But what I discovered looking at 18th century ideas about what to do with slavery and what to do with slaves was that there was no consensus about what it meant to be enlightened about slavery. And, the 18th century is the first moment in history, because slavery is a very, very old institution, thousands of years old. It follows the human condition everywhere. The 18th century is the first moment when a growing number of voices begin to cry out that this institution is not just bad for some reasons, like it's dangerous or it's unchristian or whatever, but that it is morally wrong to hold slaves. And this later gets known as the abolitionist movement. So some people who thought that they were enlightened about slavery, and again, I'm using their terminology here, said, we really just need to emancipate the slaves because that is the only enlightened way of dealing with this moral scourge. But there were others who said, well, now hang on a sec here. Why don't we just treat our slaves better? This is enlightened because it means then we don't have to confront what is potentially a larger problem, which is the emancipation of millions of people simultaneously, which will create all kinds of social disruptions in our society and imperil the body politic. So we will be enlightened by not endangering the body politic and simply treating our slaves in a more humane way. So what the chapter on slavery does is to show that self-described quest to become more enlightened about the institution of slavery did not obviously lead to the abolitionist movement of the 19th century and to the emancipation of 4 million slaves after the Civil War. That there were a number of kind of unexplored side routes that people took to try to figure out what to them it meant to be enlightened about slavery.
Yeah, it seemed in your book like there were examples of men like St. George Tucker and Joseph Learned who used the Enlightenment to explain both why society should abolish slavery and emancipate the slaves, and why slavery was a good and helpful institution.
Yeah, exactly. It's really important to recover for historians the multiplicity of attitudes towards things. You're not just pro-slavery or anti-slavery, in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are all kinds of nuanced responses to the condition of enslavement. It was harder to capture the voices of enslaved peoples themselves in the 18th century because there were, all kinds of forced illiteracy issues, and I could only go with what people were writing. So that was more difficult to capture. But there were ideas, for example, that, one might emancipate slaves in Virginia, but then just sort of move everybody into the new cotton kingdom of the South. And then everybody being white America would profit from this new social configuration of slavery and emancipation. So I wanted to add texture and nuance to the conversation of enlightenment and what that meant in the 18th century. And boy, slavery turned out to be a great prism for doing that.
When we read books and articles about the American Revolution, many of them discuss how that event, the Revolution, was an enlightened event, because it was about Americans who were enlightened and who overthrew a despotic monarch in favor of enlightened self-rule. Carolyn, would you help us recover the real story of what happened here? I mean, did 18th century Americans view and understand the American Revolution as an enlightened event? And was there any tension that existed at all between the Enlightenment and monarchy? Because my understanding of European history, which is where a lot of the Enlightenment took place, is that, with the exception of the Swiss and the Dutch, every other land had a monarch.
Everybody has a monarch, and some of them still do today. So one of the things I wanted to do was to get us off our patriotic high horse as Americans and to say, look, in the late 18th century, a lot of people still think that monarchy is a really great idea. And we can't just brand them loyalists and forget about them. And people think that monarchy is a great idea for a lot of really great and compelling reasons. For example, monarchs control enormous armies and navies very, very effectively. And before the great age of universities and private foundations, they are the great promoters of the arts and of learning. And Americans recognized this in the late 18th century. So the first thing to know is that the American Revolution was not understood by its practitioners as enlightened until after the fact. What they would do is they would do something and then they would look at it, like, write the Declaration of Independence, look at it a few years later and say, well, wasn't that an enlightened thing to do? So Enlightenment was the kind of framework for historical understanding that was imposed after the fact by the revolutionaries on the thing that they had just done. in part because they were very unsure about whether what they had just done was really a good idea or not. So I wanted to recapture the depth of commitment to the idea of monarchy as a means of enlightenment. Many people in Britain described their nation as the most enlightened in the world. So did people in France up until the French Revolution. And then thereafter, after the reinstatement of a monarchy in the form of Napoleon. So I wanted to show that it wasn't necessarily clear to anybody, whether in Europe or the United States, that a republican government was more enlightened than a monarchy. What I found was that people saw it as a series of trade-offs, and they were very unclear about whether a republic or a monarchy was the best means of achieving personal enlightenment and the enlightenment of a whole society. So there's this kind of extraordinary debate in the U.S. House of Representatives in late 1796, in which they literally spend 2 days debating whether it's okay to call the U.S. the most enlightened nation in the world. And they were really worried. First of all, they didn't know if it was true. And second, they were really worried that the Europeans would be angry at them for saying this and that they would come and, clobber them, which they weren't so far off in thinking would happen. But they were unsure. And that uncertainty can help us to understand the whole process of enlightenment in British America that I uncovered. It's not a moment of national certainty the way it began to be painted during the Cold War, during the invention of this idea of the American Enlightenment, which is this kind of mythical golden age of certainty and freedom and patriotism and all of that. In fact, enlightenment is a form of uncertainty and doubt and questioning. Who am I now? Who can I become? How can I know if I am becoming more enlightened? What else can I be doing? How do I know when I have become completely enlightened? These were questions that they had, and these were questions that the book tries to recapture, and I think can be useful for our own national self-understanding today, that we're not a nation founded on certainty about our Republican principles. We're a nation founded on open discussion of what makes a better society and polity. I think that's a much more powerful takeaway from the 18th century than a kind of pious certainty that everything was all decided and understood. So that final chapter is really important for understanding all of Enlightenment in British America.
I wonder if you would expand upon your last point a bit more, because your book, American Enlightenments, really does try to explain the Enlightenment as an ongoing process. Did that process ever end? Because if I just heard you right, it seems like you're saying that the process of the Enlightenment continues on in many ways as we interact with our own democracy and government in our own present day.
Yeah, the standard dogma has been that the Enlightenment ended around 1820 or 1830, maybe even a little before, as the rising forces of evangelical Protestantism and Romanticism, withered the delicate tendrils of reason and progress of the Enlightenment. That was also a Cold War narrative, and I found zero evidence for that kind of narrative. What I found was that people just kept wanting to be enlightened, but that over time it became a non-controversial idea. Yeah, of course, everybody wants reform, everybody wants enlightenment. That's good. It kind of gets folded into the national self-understanding, especially as Americans see themselves as a people of progress. I became acutely aware of our modern conversations about enlightenment. And, everybody today wants to be enlightened. I couldn't find a single person who didn't want to be enlightened. I did a kind of survey of a whole bunch of newspapers and magazines of the last 6 years, and the discourse of enlightenment has spread to include everything, recycling, gay rights, you name it. People wrap it in the conversation of enlightenment. So we still want to become enlightened. We have somewhat different understandings today of what it means to be enlightened, and those are important to attend to. So that's why the book ends on a note of uncertainty, saying that, Americans don't know whether they have achieved enlightenment. It is an ongoing process. It wasn't an era of American history that closed. It is part of the national fabric of American self-understanding. And that makes America very different from Europe, where Americans see themselves as being kind of on the tail end of a beautiful story of ongoing and upward enlightenment. And when we don't achieve enlightenment, we think it's a sorry deviation from what the national trajectory should be. We saw an outpouring of that after the Trump election, that this was going to be unenlightened, people said. In Europe, they have a much darker view of the heritage of the Enlightenment. So even though I'm not a big believer in American exceptionalism, this is one aspect of the American experience that sets them off from Europe, is this national optimism that is born in the 18th century and that Americans hold on to today, sometimes against a lot of countervailing evidence.
When we started our conversation, you described the Enlightenment for people of the 18th century as a series of events with a little e. And during the Cold War, that series of events became the Enlightenment with the big E. And it seems like today, we Americans have gone back to viewing the Enlightenment with an 18th century viewpoint as a series of events with a little e.
That is a beautiful encapsulation of the book. Thank you for that.
Let's move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if the United States had not achieved its independence from Great Britain? How would the lack of an independent United States have changed the Enlightenment and its American counterparts?
Oh, well, off the top of my head, I would say that it would have enabled an even more expansive articulation of the enlightening qualities of monarchical rule. Americans today do not call themselves monarchists, but you wouldn't know it for all they watch Downton Abbey and watch what the Queen is wearing and this and that. I think that if the U.S. had not happened, that if the colonies had remained colonies, that the enlightening benefits of monarchy would have been allowed to play out a lot more. And that would have been a really, really interesting thing to see happen, at least from the standpoint of an intellectual historian. So we might have had a national university, which we do not now because of Republican thinking that it was unenlightened to do so. And who knows what other cultural formations would have come about. So I would watch that with great interest.
So Carolyn, now that you've attempted to restore what 18th century Americans thought about the Enlightenment, what aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
Well, now I'm starting a new book project that actually emerges from the geology chapter. It's the untold story of how the New World became old. Americans and everybody thought that the New World was literally the newest world in the 18th century. But by 1920, it was widely understood that North America, especially Canada, was the site of some of the most ancient rocks in the world, millions, possibly billions of years old, and that antiquity was one of the things that made America great. Yellowstone National Park is the product of that late 19th century assessment that really old rocks are what makes America great. So I want to tell that story. And it's very fascinating. It involves the first discovery of climate change and all kinds of things. So that's the next project, how the New World became old.
That sounds like a fun project. Now, where can we find more information about you and how we can contact you if we still have questions about your geology project or the American Enlightenment?
Well, if you Google me, the first thing that comes up apparently is my Stanford webpage, and my email is there, and any other information that a normal person would want to know, including a CV. So, and of course, the new book itself is on Yale University Press's website and Amazon or whatever website people might want, and hopefully people will be interested.
Carolyn Winterer, thank you so much for joining us here again on Ben Franklin's World and for taking us through some of the events of the American Enlightenments.
Great. Well, I enjoyed it too. Thanks, Liz.
When early Americans discussed the Enlightenment, they always meant two things. First, using reason as opposed to myth or superstition to make the world a better place. And second, that they had it within their power to make the world a better place. As Carolyn revealed, the Enlightenment and its focus on human reason gave Americans permission to see what it was possible for human beings to achieve. And these early American human beings achieved a lot. Americans helped invent the field of geology, they made major strides in the development of the study of demography, and they started to grapple with the tough questions that slavery posed for society. Americans' enlightened ideas about the world also gave rise to the American Revolution. Today we recognize this event as taking place during the Enlightenment, but at the time, participants only stopped to consider whether the revolution had been part of the Enlightenment after the event took place. And such is the nature of history in the present, right? We live in the present and only really reflect on that present after it's already happened. And I guess we could say the same about the Enlightenment, too. The people who lived through and participated in it recognized that they were taking part in important ideas and events. But as they were taking part in them, they really had no idea how important the Enlightenment's ideas and events would be. In fact, it's also possible that they had no idea when the age of the Enlightenment would end. And as Carolyn just told us, it's quite possible that we're still participating in the Enlightenment today, just by discussing and continually shaping the ideas and philosophies that came out of it. Look for more information about Carolyn, her book American Enlightenments, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/127. If you enjoy thinking about history and new ideas, sign up for DelanceyPlace.com's free daily email with excerpts and ideas from history books. Text nonfiction to 22828 or visit dp1776.com to sign up. And thank you, DelanceyPlace.com, for sponsoring today's episode. Finally, do you think the Enlightenment has ended, or do you think it's still ongoing? Send your answers to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.